Hi, everyone. It's really lovely to be here with you. Today, I'll be talking to you about two concepts that are very overlapping, kindness and compassion. Now, these are what we would call pro-social motivations, but they're slightly different. So kindness is focused on the motivation for goodwill or bringing happiness into someone's life, including your own. And we can think of these things as almost as favors that you might do for somebody or a gesture, perhaps. And we see random acts of kindness all of the time, particularly to strangers. You know nothing about them, but we may pay for their haircut or pay for their cup of coffee or do something for them. And the whole aim there is you're trying to bring a moment of happiness, of joy, or a moment of goodwill into that person's life. So kindness is crucial for our well-being, and it makes us feel like we're cared for and part of a community that cares for each other. So it's absolutely critical for not only ourselves, but for the fabric of our society as well. It's lovely to be in a world where we feel like we could receive kindness from someone at any point. Now, compassion is slightly different in its focus. So compassion is all aimed in on suffering, and it's trying to alleviate that suffering. So the first thing that stands out really is that you can be kind to somebody who isn't suffering. So that's one point of difference, right? So you can be kind, do a favor, do a gesture for someone just to show them that they're important to you and to give them that smile on their face, and they don't have to be suffering. But for compassion, suffering's at the core. So the next point of difference is, you're kind of focused in on that suffering. So it means coming into contact with suffering and working out what we could do to help. And that kind of helpful behavior will depend on the type of suffering you come into contact with. So you might encounter emotional suffering, physical suffering, or perhaps someone has a lack of resource. So they might be without a home or they might be starving. And in those instances, we would do acts that would be congruent to the suffering that they're experiencing. Now, in some instances, a way of being compassionate is to be kind. So say you see someone being really self-critical about something, perhaps a mistake or a disappointment they had, and they're being really self-critical towards themselves. Coming in and being kind to them at that point, using a gentle and warm voice, could be a hugely important way of showing our compassion and being compassionate to this person who we care about. But let's take another example. So somebody is perhaps being abused, perhaps emotionally or physically. Now, in this instance, possibly an alternative approach would be to come in with some more assertiveness. So you might be compassionately assertive with perhaps putting boundaries down. And when you express these boundaries and perhaps say no, often these aren't experienced as kind, but rather as compassionate, as you're trying to stop suffering from continuing. You're trying to alleviate it in a way which is helpful for both you and the other. So compassion is kind of saying no at certain times because the act will bring about hurt and further suffering. It's a way of responding to when someone perhaps has been critical towards you, overly critical perhaps, or perhaps they're taking advantage of you. So in these instances, we need to be able to be compassionate towards ourselves and also try to prevent that further suffering from continuing. So that's a little bit on how kindness and compassion can differ. Both are super important. Both are really focused on pro-sociality and bringing that greater sense of pro-sociality into the world. So we definitely need both. Kindness is about creating those moments of goodwill and bringing lots of positive emotions with it as well. We often feel happiness and joy when we're being kind to another, and the person receiving the kindness also experiences that. Whereas with compassion, when you come into contact with suffering, you'll experience a range of different emotions, perhaps some sadness or even anger that someone could do something like that to them. But equally, we then start to pivot into trying to be helpful at that point. And in those instances, we can experience emotions around feeling like we've made a contribution, feel like we've been helpful. And that can bring a different sense of eudaimonia, which is sometimes used as a way to express we're doing something that's meaningful, something that matters. So they're both very similar, both really important, but there are times when kindness is really key, and at other times where what we're seeing in terms of the response is actually compassion. But that's just a little insight. It's interesting. How they work can also depend on who the target is. So we find doing kind acts for people we like very easy, the same as compassion. But if there's someone we dislike, we find being kind to them difficult, really difficult, and in fact, we'd prefer not to help. Whereas if we see someone we know who we dislike and they're suffering, we're much more likely to be compassionate to them in those instances. So there can be some differences to how kindness and compassion is turned on, which is sometimes why we can struggle with giving ourselves self-kindness, because sometimes the things that we're struggling with are things inside that we deeply dislike about ourselves. And if we find that we deeply dislike it, being kind at that point kind of is very jarring. But if you can connect with that sense of your suffering in that instance and what you could do to be compassionate to that suffering, that opens up the window just a little bit to relate to ourselves in a different way to help with that suffering. But yes, both very important. I'm a big lover of both kindness and compassion. And if you look at it in relation to Buddhism, kindness really has, in the four immeasurables, has that loving kindness aspect, which a lot of people sort of suggest that it would be better coined as friendly kindness. And on the other side, we've got compassion as part of the four immeasurables, which is focused on alleviating suffering. So there are different ways to think about kindness and compassion. At its core, we're trying to be helpful and trying to create moments of connectedness for ourselves and for others.